This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry. With agriculture broadcasters Orion Samuelson and Max Armstrong. And featuring agriculture meteorologist Greg Soulier. This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Pioneer. Proud to work with farmers in the most complex and rewarding industry on earth.
Coming up on this weekend's broadcast, so long 2020, we'll gaze into the crystal ball for this new year. Hello everyone, welcome to this weekend's broadcast. Happy New Year to you. Well, there were people already in the middle part of 2020 saying, let's get it over with. Let's go on to the new year ahead already. There were some very difficult challenges, not just throughout the nation's economy and around the world, but especially in the farm economy too. Yet black swan events sometimes provide opportunity, and some people in agriculture were able to do amazingly well. As we make that transition over to the new year, we like to check in with farm broadcasters around the country because historically, as we've known year after year, they stay close to the audiences they serve. The cattlemen and women, the farmers, the folks out in the ranching community, and nobody fits that description better than the voice of Radio Oklahoma Network, Ron Hayes, who joins us here. Ron, by my calculation, you've been doing this doggone near 50 years. Am I right?
We're getting close, Max, that's for sure.
Well, one of these days, you and I will figure this all out. You do such a superb job, by all means, in serving your farmers in that part of the world and trying to stay abreast of what's going on. One thing I've noticed over the past few weeks, as we get into this new year of 2021, there seemed to be a little bit of encroachment of the drought moving into that Oklahoma area. It's pretty powerful in some of the areas to the west, but it seemed to be getting a little more significant in Oklahoma.
It has kind of been up and down a little bit here in the fall months of 2020, Max, and we are concerned about that. Our westernmost counties have had their share of drought this year. And we've gotten some nice rains here in the fall, though, that have mitigated some of the problems, pushed maybe the worry back a little bit. But for folks in our part of the country, the Southern Plains, we always are a little bit worried about what Mother Nature might throw us regarding dryness.
As I looked at the drought monitor maps toward the end of 2020, it looked like you didn't have to go too far to get into some very dry areas, either to the west or to the south, down into the Texas Panhandle areas, for example.
That's definitely the case. Our westernmost counties, including the Oklahoma Panhandle, Texas Panhandle, get over to southwestern Kansas and on over to Colorado, New Mexico. There's a lot of red, a lot of dryness on that drought monitor map, and it can very easily expand eastward and catch a lot more of our counties in a hurry if we're not careful.
How did the wheat crop go in this past fall in Oklahoma? And were some of your growers, as they watched market response, wishing that maybe they had a little more wheat acreage?
I think, everybody's pretty pleased with as far as the overall getting the 2021 wheat crop into the ground. We were pretty dry in the major part of the planting season. We really plant in two different waves of planting in the Southern Plains and in northern Texas, Oklahoma, into southern Kansas. We plant early, trying to catch some wheat pasture for our cattle, and that's a pretty important deal for our producers. And then that second wave of planting around after the 1st of October toward Halloween or thereabouts, we're really planting more for grain production. That'll be the harvest of next June. We were pretty dry up till about mid-October, and then we got some significant rains. Unfortunately, some of that came with a good bit of ice too, especially in central and western Oklahoma. Gave us some problems along those lines, but still, bottom line, this wheat crop's got a lot of moisture in the ground to help us carry through probably a good bit of the winter.
Sometimes you can have 4 seasons in almost a week's time, it seems like, in Oklahoma. The pendulum can really swing, especially in those northern counties, I've noticed.
That's definitely the case. And, we really went from worrying about maybe having almost no wheat pasture this year to just in a matter of those 2 or 3 rains that came in a hurry to getting some pretty good wheat pasture. And we've got a lot of cattle that have moved in now and are starting to be utilizing that particular forage, which is very, very important to the bottom line of these guys.
Well, since you mentioned cattle, what are you hearing from those folks as to the kind of year they had and how they're looking into 2021 here now?
It was a tough spring. Everybody faced that, and you may recall that that first assistance package that the administration came up with, Congress and the administration came up with, CFAP 1, had a cutoff date on the actual amount of money that was available to producers of April 15th. Unfortunately, that hit us right in the middle of moving a lot of cattle off wheat pasture, some of the winter type pastures, to the market. So there were a lot of guys that sold just before that. They got a nice stipend from Uncle Sam. The others got not nearly as much. The CFAP 2 has helped some, and I think that's really helped the attitude of our producers quite a bit. Fall sales have been good. The sales of both some of our yearlings earlier in the fall, and now we've had these calf runs that have come kind of the second half of the fall that have really been pretty good, and the markets have been, I think, pretty encouraging for our producers by and large. So
it's kind of nice to see a lifting of spirits a little bit as we turn that page on the calendar.
You bet. One thing that we're kind of excited about in Oklahoma is something that has kind of landed in our lap this year from Denver. They decided to cancel the National Western. We've got some folks that have stepped up working with the beef cattle breeds, and they're going to be doing something called Cattlemen's Congress early January to kind of replace National Western this year. World Championship for a lot of these cattle organizations, big sales, big shows, and a lot of excitement for the state fairgrounds in Oklahoma City.
We'll watch with great interest. Thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate it. Good to see you, and Happy New Year to you, Ron.
Same to you, Max.
Ron Hayes with the Radio Oklahoma Network. This portion of This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by the Soybean Checkoff. Tips, videos, how-tos, and more. If it has to do with ag tech, you'll find it in the Tech Tool Shed, your unbiased one-stop resource. Well, as we're beginning the new year here, we wanted to check in with a farm broadcaster friend in Minnesota. Joe Gill is on the radio at KASM in Albany, Minnesota. Joe, first of all, let's try to get 2020 all the way behind us. Many people want to do that quickly, but look back on that year. And how were your growers in Minnesota treated? First of all, set the stage a little bit for where you are in the state and the lay of the land where you are.
Thanks, Max. I always like to say KASM Radio in Albany, Minnesota. Stearns County, we're in the belly button of Minnesota, pretty much right in that middle sector, right along I-94. We are roughly about 90 minutes west of the Twin Cities, a metro area, and about 3 hours from that Fargo and Minnesota border. So you mentioned 2020, Max. I think a lot of farmers are excited to see 2020 leave and maybe a prosperous 2021. But in 2020, here in this area, Max, we saw a lot of farmers have just an outstanding year in the fall as far as harvest came around. And that really served as a silver lining to a very tough year.
We happened to visit with the Minnesota Farm Bureau President Kevin Papp at about that time. He was out at his field at harvest time, and he was pretty upbeat about what he was seeing there and the ability to get in there and get that crop out in a timely manner.
It's so true, and we had such a unique fall as well. In October, we got really cold at the end, and I thought, all right, it's here to stay, buckle in for a long winter. Then we got to November, it melted, and we saw record highs for roughly 4, 5, 6 straight days in early November. And as of right now, we still have no snow on the ground, and that second opportunity gave farmers a big chance to get their beans and their corn in.
There was a major political shift in that area where you folks are heard among farm families. Colin Peterson, longtime member of the United States House of Representatives and a powerful member of the House Agriculture Committee who had guided a lot of important farm legislation, lost his re-election bid. What was the attitude? I know some people might have been thinking, okay, time for a change, and others were saying, uh-oh, this could spell trouble for the future. What did you hear, Joe?
You know, Max, I think it's a little of both, where I think a lot of folks said, all right, did we just bite the hand that was kind of feeding us over the recent decades and his expertise and his know-how? And we're in such a dairy-intensive area here in central Minnesota, and he worked really hard on the Farm Bill when it came to dairy margin coverage. But when you look at the map, how people voted in the state too, metro area, southern Minnesota near Mankato, northeastern portions of the state, very heavy Democratic areas. Outstate or greater Minnesota, there was a lot of red. They voted Republican, and I think that's what carried Michelle Fischbach over and will take over to represent his portion of the state.
You mentioned dairy. It was a wild ride at times for some of the folks who milk cows, and I guess a lot of people are wondering, well, where could that milk price go here in 2021, especially as we've seen in recent reports, more cows being milked and more output per cow.
You know, it's a crystal ball I think a lot of dairy farmers wish they had. You look back at 2020, I think a lot of folks thought, all right, this dairy margin coverage program, we're going to see it go to work because we're going to see prices really struggle. And then there you go, the final 5-6 months, we saw some of the government programs shift in and help out. And we saw milk over $20 consistently in a latter portion of 2020. But you look at 2021, there's a $7 to $8 drop in milk. So you can already feel the anxiety in the dairy sector where, all right, we're at 20, 21, 23. Now we're at 15, 16. What are we going to see as we see some of these signups draw some attention here for the next year?
Finally, in the last few seconds, is that kind of volatility having a chilling effect on young men and women coming back to the dairy farm, Joe?
You know, I think in a positive way to look at it, Max, I think it's allowing some people to get into it or maybe develop a little more, whether it's as picking up some land or maybe some opportunities where some folks in their 50s and 60s who might be looking to retire or seeing this as a window to get out and maybe opening that door for that next generation. So I think there is a silver lining in that area.
What a great job you do serving growers in that part of the region and dairy men and women. Thank you, Joe, at KASM Radio, Albany, Minnesota. Now, agriculture meteorologist Greg Soulier brings us his farm weather forecast for the nation for the week ahead. It's presented by Pivot BioProven, the nitrogen-producing microbes that stay put, whether or not. At our New Year's broadcast, we visit with our weatherman who gives us guidance the year round. 52 weeks of the year, I rely on Greg Soulier for some weather help. You know what? It might be helpful because you're here every week, and we just assume everybody knows your background. What is your history in weather forecasting?
30 years in the business, graduate of Northern Illinois University way back, and I'll give you the year, 1984. You can do the math at home. But more importantly, really got my education working with a gentleman by the name of Earl Finkel, who kind of pioneered with yourself and Orion this whole business. So that's where we got our roots, our education, really in the weather business.
And that was before there was a lot of computer guidance. Earl instructed you to forecast the weather the old-fashioned way.
That's right, and that is still the way we do it, despite the run of models out there. That's 12 or 15 different forecasts as far as we're concerned. So it's a little bit older school, an Air Force technique, but you know what? It works still.
One thing we noticed at the end of 2020, as well as at the end of 2019, the drought area over the 48 states was not insignificant.
That's right, and that really highlights the weather map and scene here in 2020 across the western states, and an eastward expansion of that with time from drought to wildfires to drought to heat to the lack of a really dismal monsoon season. That's why we have seen this expansion here into the plains in 2020. Note the tropical lows. This, as far as we're concerned, is really the other highlight scene with the excess of tropical systems named all the way into the Greek alphabet. Very wet weather through the southeastern part of the country. Other highlights included that severe weather outbreak around Nashville, the Great Derecho effect from Iowa into the central Corn Belt, the early freeze into the northern parts of the Midwest and upper Midwest, either too wet, too dry. Max, it was all over creation on the maps and charts in 2020.
Yeah, there was quite a train of tropical storms coming along. We exhausted the names and moved into some new ones. La Nina.
Yes.
That's a big part of this story, isn't it?
That's right. It was getting underway back in 2019. As a comparison, here's what 2019 looked like regarding drought over the western states, focused across the southwest parts of Texas, about normal across the heartland. It was too wet through the upper Midwest, too dry in the southeast. Now, with that La Nina pattern still into play, look at this at the end of 2020. Into Washington state, some modest improvement, big sky expansion into into the northern plains, expansion through the central Corn Belt, the northeastern New England, southern parts of the plains, and across the west. 80% of the western states in some sense of exceptional drought pattern. And we're going to keep an eye on the southeastern states as well, Max, with time. On to the meteorological whys, as you had pointed out. Rains were kind of timely through the upper Midwest. Here's the hot ridge over the western part of the country. In a typical La Nina setup, you get to weather systems that come up the eastern seaboard. This year, it was tropical features north and west of the tropical path here. You get high pressure sinking air, and you get compressional warming and the expansion of heat and drought into the Great Lakes areas, the central Corn Belt, the plains and southwestern part of the country. So until La Nina breaks down, this weather pattern is still drought ridden over many areas of the plains and southwest.
As I recall, toward the end of 2020, I thought I saw a statistic that almost half of the lower 48 was in some form of drought or dryness. Now, some of that's not severe drought, and some could be corrected. Correct?
That's right, and we're hoping as we continue to move about into the wintertime season before those grounds continue to lock up, we'll get some improvement. We've kind of put together here roughly an outlook of what you would expect typically in a La Nina setup, and it kind of really fits the textbook this year. Improvement already beginning to get underway across northern California, the Pacific Northwest. The drought pattern, though, in a La Nina setup, those jet stream winds in from the west and northwest, they buckle here, swing through the northeastern New England. So with time, we anticipate, whether it's rainfall, snowpack, and the snow melt come springtime, some improvement over northern and central Illinois, the Great Lakes region into the northeastern New England, and already beginning to see that at the current time as well. Surprisingly, in all the tropical systems, the historic nature to them into areas of eastern Texas, the Gulf Coast area, and the southeast, grounds are overtly wet. What do you anticipate? Drought. We expect additional dryness and drought to develop over the course of the next couple of months across areas of the southeastern plains, Delta region, in through Florida, and parts of the mid-Atlantic region. So it promises to be a pretty action-packed, certainly 2021 on the maps and charts, and we certainly hope all the best to you. Happy, healthy, prosperous new year. Matter of fact, speaking of 20 and 21, we'll take a look at that extended outlook, the spring outlook, coming up in the next half hour here on This Week in Agribusiness.
Well, this has been anything but a typical year in agriculture, and that means there were so many meetings that were not held in person. They had to be virtual meetings. That was the case as we went into the meeting season at the end of 2020, and several of the State Farm Bureau organizations, of course, and almost all of them, I guess, as far as I know, that were to have had meetings at the end of the year did so virtually. That's tough because farmers and ranchers and others in agriculture who hold their meetings in the meeting season very much look forward to getting together not only to plan their policy that guides the organization for the year ahead, to learn from each other, but there's that friendship as well that is established and the networking that takes place. Such was the case with our meeting of the National Association of Farm Broadcasting. We had to meet virtually this year, and that left many of us feeling, well, we were robbed a little bit simply because we look forward to the event each November. Here's a guy that we always look forward to visiting with, whether it's in person or virtually. From the Iowa Agribusiness Network, Dustin Hoffman, farm broadcaster. Dustin, you haven't been doing this terribly long, have you?
No, I can't say that I have. You know, this whole virtual thing has been long enough, but yeah, it's been a long time here that I feel like since we've seen anybody in person, Max.
As a farm broadcaster, when did you start? How many years ago?
I actually started 6 years ago. So in 2014 is when I was first named a broadcaster at KLGR Radio in Redwood Falls, Minnesota.
Well, these days, as you're serving farmers across the state of Iowa, one big thing that comes to mind after we put 2020 behind us was what happened the 10th of August, 2020. Describe that event that had a very substantial effect right across the heart of the state of Iowa.
You know, Max, it's one of those things, and I'm sure a lot of farmers will understand that moment when you walk outside, and it was 6:30 in the morning when that day started for me when I first went outside, and you can feel it in the air that something's just not right. It was one of those days where the temperatures were already in the high 80s at 6:30 in the morning, and it was just, you could cut the air with a fork. It was so humid out there. And I remember saying, if there was going to be a storm, today would be the day. And there was talk that there was going to be some thunderstorms coming that midday. And sure enough, about 10 o'clock, I had finished up one of my reports and my children were home, and they came downstairs and said the sirens were going off. And I went upstairs and it was as dark as night outside. And within a few minutes, I watched the neighbor's furniture go blowing down the street. I saw things just rattling across the street at our local water park that we have, tents blowing away like they were made of nothing, and trash cans actually in the air going down as that derecho that we heard so much about hit. And it was about a good 20 to 30 minutes of just really intense wind. I've been through tornadoes, I've been through high winds and straight line winds, but I've never been through what seemed like a straight line wind that ended up going for 20 minutes or longer as that front pushed its way through Des Moines where I live. And after that, I went out to look at the crops, and close to Des Moines, I looked at it and thought, things don't look too bad. But the closer I got to Ames and that Highway 30 corridor, I noticed that things were not looking good at all, and this may not be a good year for some of the farmers in central Iowa. And by golly, it turned out to be something that didn't turn out very well for us at all. The yields could have been worse than what they ended up being, but not what we wanted, and it seemed par for the course for 2020.
As I recall, the boundaries on that storm would have been just about Route 20 on the north and then Interstate 80 on the south. And as you said, that US 30 corridor there was where they really took a beating. Farmsteads were roughed up, not just the crops, but buildings too, correct?
Yes. In fact, not far from where I live in Ankeny on the north side of Des Moines, there was a few miles north was a new bin site that had been going up since the summer, and it was just about completed. And now you've got two brand new empty bins that were crushed like soda cans right there in the middle of a bean field. Elevators, grain legs down, barns that had the steel torn off of them, just flipped off like it was paper being pulled off of a ream. It was amazing how far some of the stuff had been blown away. One town just north of us, Huxley, one of their grain bins completely collapsed, and a very tall, several thousand bushel grain bin completely toppled where the roof had blown off in the middle of town. I don't know where it ended up, but I pray it didn't end up on somebody's house. We weren't able to get into some of those parts of town to look. But yes, it was a lot of structural damage, both in the rural communities and in the farming areas as well. And of course, that didn't even begin to touch the crop damage.
When it came to harvesting their crop, it seemed the weatherman was cooperating, at least at that point. The producers were able to move through the fields in a relatively unfettered fashion. Still, it was slow going, wasn't it? It was painfully slow for some, but did they wind up, after all was said and done, getting most of the crop?
They did. I did hear a few more farmers that after they tried to wade into the fields, they contacted their adjusters, and the adjusters did rule that these were going to be lost fields. Some people had rollers that they could put on their combines and make a go of it. I did talk to one farmer who had an average speed of 2.4 miles an hour and could only go from one direction in his cornfield. Right. But he said the yields could have been a lot worse than they were. I mean, you have to remember, on August 10th, a lot of those corn plants were in a good place. And in fact, when I talked to my friends in the crop tours that have looked around the city, looked around the states, said that was some of the best looking corn they had seen in Iowa. And in fact, with the drought we had, it was some of the best looking corn we saw. And it was like wherever Mother Nature didn't get us with drought, she knocked it over with wind. But it could have been worse, but it was still a dogged procedure to get that corn off the ground.
For sure. Well, here's to a better 2021 for your growers and the people who serve them there in the state of Iowa. Dustin, it's great to visit with you as always.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate it.
Happy New Year to you. That's Dustin Hoffman. He's on the radio on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, reaching those producers across the state of Iowa. There's more coming up on our special year-end edition of the show.
This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by ADM.
Welcome back to this weekend's edition of This Week in Agribusiness. As we close the books on 2020 and we look into the weeks ahead, we tend to focus, I think, all too often on the negatives and the bad things that could be coming along, but there may be opportunities as well from several things that we see right now on the agriculture front. Looking over the months ahead, one thing that farmers and ranchers will need to be concerned about, their costs of doing business. No matter if the prices are up or they're under pressure, it always pays to watch those costs. And Bryce Nord does a superb job of that. He's a contributing market analyst for Farm Futures. Bryce, let's talk about fertilizer to begin with. For much of 2020, producers saw some pretty good prices on those inputs.
Well, of course, we had the same factors that have really been affecting all markets in 2020, which was the coronavirus. That certainly impacted the fertilizer market. We saw some very cheap prices because nobody was buying. And in some cases, prices hit 10, 12-year lows, so some really good opportunities. Now, those opportunities, by and large, are all gone. The fertilizer is starting to move around the world again as the economy, particularly in China, really ramps up steam, and hopefully will get going around the rest of the world as well. We also have higher grain prices, so that's going to encourage more acres, and you can afford more fertilizer with $4 corn than you can with $3 corn.
What's your sense? To what degree did farmers take advantage of those lower values? Many of them had the opportunity to do some fall fertilization if they wanted to do so.
Right, and we saw a very active fall fertilization season. A lot more got down this past fall than the previous year, of course, when we were still dealing with the impacts of the flood. So the farmers who did that, I think, can probably give themselves a pat on the back. Because the pipeline now is pretty dry, particularly for things like ammonia. And that means that the ammonia prices that farmers pay this spring could be $70 to $80 higher than they were this fall. So I have a rule of thumb that you want to buy fertilizer in a month that starts with a J. And that means January. So I think folks, if they haven't booked what they need, particularly if they have on-farm storage or can make a deal with their local supplier to store it for them at a reasonable cost, that could be preferable than trying to get it for spring delivery just when you need it.
What's your feeling about energy costs, and specifically as growers take a look at the diesel fuel that they're going to need for the season ahead?
Well, again, we saw some real bargain basement prices there in March and April, and really throughout the summer for diesel. Diesel has picked up some following crude oil higher. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of upside in diesel. Not to the area where we were a year ago, and it's hard to remember, but a year ago, diesel on the board was $2.20, and farmers were paying $2.40, $2.60 a gallon for diesel. So prices are going to be lower than that, but they are going to be higher than we saw this spring. I don't see a tremendous amount of explosiveness to the upside in the energy market. And that's simply because at $50 crude oil, all those fields in the U.S. Can come back into production and start pumping again. So that would overwhelm the world market with supply, force prices down. So it looks like $50 is probably about a lid on the crude oil market. My average price forecast for crude oil is $45. Which is going to be a little bit more expensive than we saw on average for 2020, but not dramatically so. Of course, the energy market can always be rolled by world events. All it takes is a few wars or another major health problem, God forbid, to really send that market either higher or lower.
Thanks for looking into the crystal ball for us. We appreciate it, Bryce. Always good to see you.
You bet, Max.
Bryce Nord, contributing analyst for Farm Futures. Now, Greg Soulier is back with his extended farm weather forecast for the country. Presented by Pivot Bio Proven. Visit pivotbio.com to find a representative near you. Well, we're wondering about those weeks of winter ahead of us yet. You know, we generally have a meeting season, as I mentioned earlier on the broadcast. That isn't happening in most instances this year. A lot of folks will be staying home. Greg Soulier, let's see what's going to happen as we move on and get on into the spring.
Yep.
But I want to come back. You mentioned La Nina earlier. We talked about this. How does La Nina affect the continental United States weather situation?
Now recall, 3/4 of the planet made up of water, so ocean temperatures have a direct influence on how the atmosphere behaves. In an El Nino, that is warming out there across the central waters of the Pacific, and there are other indices in Australia that we keep an eye out for. In a La Nina setup, that is cooling of those same waters. So there is an influence, a different change of steering currents. Typically, they strengthen up aloft. They are fast moving the jet stream winds that sometimes in some years can mean a dynamic weather pattern, particularly as it gets applied to the middle and late wintertime season.
Does it mean drought or does it mean flooding or precipitation?
It can really be both. As a matter of fact, we'll take a look at it here, the extended maps and charts here in through the rest of winter time. And again, this is a very fast flow. Remember, the jet stream winds typically increase anyway during the winter time season. With the contrast to temperatures, you get that at the surface and up at airplane level. So here is this broad trough across the middle part of the country. Haven't seen a lot of cold. We had it more back in autumn than we have thus far into the winter time season, but at least a sliver of it from Big Sky country across the Great Lakes region. Look at the warm still playing in through California, the southwest, down through areas of the southeastern part of the country and into parts of the Tennessee Valley. You get this particular setup, not good news. And I think we have additional fire concerns still through this winter season in the southwest, including Southern California, drying out across eastern Texas, the Gulf Coast area. Remember, we talked about that. That's a trademark of La Nina. At the same time, moisture and a stormier weather picture midwinter in the Pacific Northwest. We'll get that snow cover going. Northern and central plains, northern and central Corn Belt into the northeast of New England. Storms will tend to wind up here and across the Pacific Northwest. So some opportunity in those northern areas, Max, for some moisture recharge.
So late winter, let's go on into, say, the month of February, early March. Will we see that cold air mass across the north expand, or will it be fairly well contained that you pointed to for the weeks ahead?
Generally well contained, but at the same time, remember, we're warming up, okay? We're approaching the equinox, springtime, so we still have warmth that will continue to build with time northward. Here's this lingering cold. You put those two together, and a trough, this buckle, this U-shaped configuration across the middle part of the country. So there's warmth here in the southeastern part of the country. Great news for citrus down in this part of the country, but below average temperatures and not a lot of harsh cold, just a bit below average, but still there's some good news for the Pacific Northwest. Additional storminess now builds in late winter time, northern and central Corn Belt and plains into the Ohio Valley, the northeast of New England, drying out here, still dry southwest parts of the country into the central and southern valleys of California too.
Let's take a peek at spring. More of our growers are trying to plant a little bit earlier in the heart of the Corn Belt. More of them trying to put soybeans in earlier because they get results doing it. How does that outlook appear for you?
There's still some lingering cold air, nothing harsh, but still wintertime holding on a little longer than we'd like to see. Northern Great Lakes into areas of the eastern Canadian prairie, the warmth of the western part of the country. Temperatures about normal here with soil readings in mind. At the same time, though, remember that contrast of temperatures. So we pick up moisture, hopefully some drought improvement here, but it'll be ongoing into springtime in the Pacific Northwest. It'll be ongoing and still making headlines well into the spring over California, the central and southern plains. Look at the active moisture pattern for the northern and eastern Corn Belt areas of the northeast of New England. We'll keep an eye on summertime, maybe Max, some dryness issues coming into play.
To visit with us for a minute or two about this topsy-turvy year, Mike Pearson, our colleague here at This Week in Agribusiness. I know you're going to talk with an FFA officer, the president, about what they have gone through. That'll be coming up. But they had their meeting virtually. Many farmers had meetings virtually. But what a year it was to thrust agriculture in the spotlight, really front and center.
That's exactly the truth, Max. And when we think back on 2020, of course, we're going to think of the challenges that we faced this year, whether it was getting toilet paper, marketing fat cattle or fat hogs, or trying to, piece together profitability in the grain stage. 2020 threw a lot of challenges at us earlier in the year. But one thing it did do is it brought agriculture mainstream. We had the Wall Street Journal talking agriculture. We had New York Times. We had all of these publications that don't typically take a look at rural America. really focusing in. And I think this could be a blessing and a curse, but it's something that growers have to be aware of in my mind as we go forward into 2021. Max?
Well, a survey at about mid-year said agriculture was the most respected profession in America. It had been up there in the higher ranks of the past, but not number one.
That's true. And you think we're competing with doctors in 2020 and folks trust farmers more. That's an incredible attribute or tribute to the work that growers have done. But I do think as we get into this year, we're going to have to remain vigilant. When we think of this kind of outside interest in our industry, it's a blessing and a curse, right? In the meat space, we've got folks who have never thought twice about where they buy their hamburgers now really thinking about it, reaching out, talking to growers, buying directly when it comes to protein. This is a really fun change that could present some exciting opportunities for growers who want to put in the time to market directly or have the product that can be marketed directly. This could be a paradigm shift, Max.
Well, as one expert pointed out a couple of weeks ago on our show, these younger consumers coming along now have a real interest in their food, as you pointed out, but they want transparency. You don't try any games with younger consumers, and they can research with that mouse, of course.
Absolutely. I mean, everything is on the internet nowadays, and I think that comment is really tells us something. When we think about trouble that industries have gotten into in the past, right? It's not the work they do, it's the cover-up. It pays to be honest from the start. And I think in agriculture, we've really got some benefits in that we have beautiful scenery. We've got beautiful backdrops. When we're promoting our operation on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and you name it, we've got the scenery that few other folks can match, Max.
Let us not forget, public policy is determined by public opinion. Public policy encompasses so many things as far as agriculture is concerned. Environmental regulation, that could be pitfalls in abundance for farmers. Then, of course, there is farm policy. Very soon, they'll be holding hearings on writing a new farm bill. Will there be closer scrutiny of agriculture because of the government payments that came into the ag industry over the past 12 months?
I think that is something we absolutely have to be prepared for. Whether or not it'll happen, who knows? But we do know that in 2020, the federal government supported agriculture in ways that it really hasn't, unless you go back to the 1930s. And while that's
not that it wasn't necessary.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the trade war, when you look at the price of commodities at the start of this year, that government assistance certainly looked like it was going to be required. And it was received. The American farmer received a lot of federal assistance. However, we're going to have to pay the piper, is my concern. As we get into Farm Bill renegotiation, which will be starting here, Max, in the next 12 to 18 months, we'll be in the thick of it. Folks are going to remember that agriculture was the beneficiary during a tough time, and we've got to make sure that we are still on their side. They still trust us as an industry as we get into that Farm Bill time so that the things we've grown used to that help secure our operations don't go by the wayside.
I think one concern will be, can we keep it a farm bill? Obviously, with such a high percentage being domestic nutrition programs, more people want to have a voice in what goes into the farm bill. And they're not necessarily farm-oriented or farm-based.
That's true. That's where that outreach comes in. Be talking to your congressional representatives, whether or not you agree with them. This is the year to make those bridges happen.
We appreciate your expertise, as always, sir, in analyzing things. We'll count on it again as we go through 2021.
Always a pleasure.
Mike Pearson here, sorting it all out for us this weekend on This Week in Agribusiness. The FFA Chapter Tribute is sponsored by Nationwide, the #1 farm insurer in the country. To register your FFA chapter, go to nationwidesupportsffa.com. That's nationwidesupportsffa.com. Nationwide, we stand for you.
As we continue our chapter spotlight into the national officer team this week, we are talking to the big dog, Doster Harper, the current president of the national FFA team. Doster, you were elected at the first virtual FFA convention in history. Tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Yes, sir. It was very hard to describe. It was a surreal moment. I wasn't expecting to have my new jacket presented to me there at the election. That was the coolest surprise of it all. But just to be there surrounded by my family at that virtual announcement was really cool. That's something that no other candidate has ever gotten in the past before. And to be surrounded by the folks who got me there and sacrificed so much for me, and just to be able to embrace them as soon as the announcement was made was a special moment that I'll never forget for sure.
It's different, but it's still special. And I think that's something that applies to a lot of different things this year. Doster, one of the things that the National FFA team does is travel around the country. You work with chapters all over the place. This year, that's going to be a challenge. Have you guys discussed how you're going to handle the outreach aspects of your work?
We have, just a little bit. And to be frank, it's still pretty unknown right now. We're getting to Indianapolis the first week of January, so our team will actually be able to be together in person in Indianapolis starting in January. We're going to go through about a month to 2 months of training. And so we're hoping by the end of our training, things will be loosened up a lot more and we'll be able to travel beginning by then. But we'll still see. We're still hoping to engage with a lot of chapters virtually, even though we won't be able to travel. But typically the national officer team will spend about 300 days on the road. It doesn't look like we'll get to be able to travel that much. But we are hoping that by the end of February, once we're done with all our training, things will be loosened up a lot more. The pandemic will be loosened up over the summer, and we'll be able to get out on the road and be with students in person.
That is fantastic. Doing things virtually, of course, has been an ongoing theme for the past 8 months. And when we think of ag classes, a lot of the work that those advisors do needs to be in person. It's a hands-on type of activity. I was talking to an advisor, and he said teaching welding virtually can be quite a challenge. What have you heard? How are chapters making this adaptation for this crazy year?
Right. I think a lot of chapters are getting into that virtual mindset and engaging a lot of virtual chapter meetings. I know the Locust Grove FFA chapter here in Georgia has done a great job with virtual meetings because, you know, they talked about it allows them the opportunity to have guest speakers from all across the country who might not even be able to come to their chapter meeting in person, which is a really cool thing. I think they had like a Lamaze instructor from California or something zoom into one of their chapter meetings, because that's a cool opportunity that they have. And then a lot of other chapters are still being able to do in-person projects outside of the classroom, socially distanced. Because the beauty of agricultural education, it is in a way set up for in-person instruction during a pandemic, because supervised agricultural experiences for students are a project that's required, and it's required to be done outside of the classroom, which allows for social distancing in itself. And so a lot of chapters are able to still maintain those projects in the field or in the barn while maintaining a 6-foot distance from each other and still being able to be safe while they're doing it as well.
It's incredible the way advisors across the country have met these challenges and found creative ways to overcome them. And I want to ask you about the overall health of the organization after this crazy year. What does membership look like in 2020, 2021?
Membership is just over 750,000 right now, and we're still climbing. Agricultural education is moving towards 100% affiliation with National FFA, meaning that soon in the next couple of years, we hope that every single agricultural education student in the country will be affiliated and thereby an automatic member of National FFA. So we're at about 760,113 students right now. And we know that there are over 1 million agricultural education students enrolled in an agricultural education class in the country. So we're hoping we'll get above that 1 million mark here in the next couple of years. But we're sitting pretty well right now at above 750,000 and still climbing for sure.
That's fantastic. And Doster, of course, you are currently a college student. After you complete your year of service and you finish up with college, what does the future hold for you?
Yes, sir. I'm a third-year student at the University of Georgia right now, studying agri-science and environmental systems. But I'm also an Army ROTC cadet at the University of Georgia. So I've got a 100% guaranteed job when I graduate. I'll be commissioning into the Army as a second lieutenant. And I'm extremely excited for that. I'm looking forward to that opportunity. And I'll look and see. My scholarship says I got to serve for 4 years. But after that, hopefully I'll get to study some crop science.
Fantastic. Well, Doster Harper, thank you so much for your service, both to the National FFA and to the country as you go forward into the future.
Well, we made it. Through the tumultuous months of 2020, we've made it into this new year. And maybe one thing that has come about because of what has happened in these past few months is that we've put things into perspective a little bit in our lives. Maybe taking a better accounting of the matters that really matter. I often read the comments of Dr. David Cole. He is a columnist in Farm Futures magazine. He's a professor emeritus at Virginia Tech University. And Dr. Cole is on the program many years at the Farm Futures Business Summit. And we've had the chance to visit personally and I have not only enjoyed his presentations, but as I said, I've read his pearls of wisdom, as he refers to them in his column. He watches globally the trends that are taking place, not just in agriculture, but in economics and society as a whole. And he wrapped up a recent column with these thoughts that are so important and so applicable, not just in agriculture, but in a variety of businesses and industries too. He was referring to that generation coming along behind us. And Dr. David Cole said this. He said, the best crop you will ever raise will be the young people in your life. Be a mentor, educator, or a supporter of youth organizations such as 4-H and FFA. They are a great investment, Dr. Cole said. Oh, I think it's very true. Not just in agriculture, as I said, but if you take a look at the business that you're involved in, maybe away from the business of food production, you'll find, too, that generation coming along, especially now, is going to need some help. Through this education process, it's very challenging, and sometimes just keeping them encouraged is going to be one of the most important things you can do. Well, thank you so much for being with us through the past year. On behalf of Orion Samuelson and Mike Pearson and Greg Soulier, our friend Chad Colby, and the guys behind the scenes so important in our broadcast, Angelo Lazara, Ryan Rue, and Tim Lowe, we wish you a happy new year. We look forward to being here with you again to tell you what's happening in the world of agriculture. So long, everyone.
Closed captioning for This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Kubota. Shape your world. This Week in Agribusiness has been brought to you by Pioneer and ADM. This Week in Agribusiness is produced by Omax Communications in association with 22 Creative Group. We invite you to visit us online at agbizweek.com.